This is Democracy,
a podcast about the people of the United States.
A podcast about citizenship.
About engaging with politics and the world around you.
A podcast about educating yourself on today's important issues.
And how to have a voice in what happens next.
Welcome to our new episode of This is Democracy. We are back from our rare week of vacation at the end of the year. Zachary, did you miss the podcast while we were away?
Well, I missed these wonderful conversations, but I certainly didn't miss all the preparatory work that goes in.
Right. It was nice to have a week off. Well, we're in for a real treat today. We're starting 2023 with our first podcast of the new year with one of our favorite people, a leading scholar, but more than that, a true mensch, someone who is studying psychology and society and leadership at a cutting edge, but also bringing that work to a large audience around the world. This is someone who's well known to many of our listeners, Professor Art Markman. Art, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, it's really a pleasure to be here talking with both of you.
Art is the Annabel, Irion, Worsham Centennial Professor of Psychology and Marketing at the University of Texas at Austin. He's the founding director of many, many things. I'm just going to name some of them. The Human Dimensions of Organizations program, which is a fantastic leadership program. He's the former executive director of the IC² Institute, which is a really unique institute bringing scholarship and policy, particularly at the local and state level, together. And he's currently Vice Provost for continuing and professional education and new education ventures at the University of Texas at Austin. In his spare time, Art is a prolific and insightful writer for many important publications, both academic and non-academic. He writes for Psychology Today, for Fast Company, for the Harvard Business Review, publishes in all the leading peer-reviewed journals in psychology and other fields. And he's written a number of wonderful books that I want to recommend to those of you who have not read them yet. Smart Thinking, which is really a wonderful book on learning to think more effectively. Smart Change is another book focused more on organizational change. Bring Your Brain to Work, wonderful title. I wish I had thought of that title first, Art. And Brain Briefs, co-written with our colleague, Dr. Robert Duke. Beyond the UT campus, Art is often heard in various settings as a prominent public lecturer, and he's the co-host with Bob Duke of Two Guys on Your Head, which is a KUT radio show and podcast that I highly recommend to many of you. And most importantly of all, Art plays saxophone in an Austin ska band called Phineas Gage. What Art does not do is sleep, obviously. Is that correct, Art?
No, I'm a big believer in sleep, actually.
I think you actually sleep more than I do. You're just more efficient than I am. I think that's what it is. So before we turn to our conversation with Art, and today we are going to talk about the effects of the pandemic, which is still going on, but is in a different phase from where it was almost 3 years ago. We're going to talk about the effects of the pandemic on the ways we interact with one another as citizens, the ways our civics have changed for good and for bad following the pandemic. But before we talk about that, we are going to turn to our scene-setting poem from Mr. Zachary Suri. Zachary, what's the title of your poem today?
Our Lonely Midnight Feasts.
Okay, you're getting me hungry already. Let's hear it.
It seems a wonder the sky doesn't fall, that the world still spins we don't see at all, for we've escaped from the guts of the beast, from our cold and our lonely midnight feasts. So pardon us if we forget the tunes of anthems we sang like the lakeside loons, as if the truth could be bought with a song that comes to nothing, just a worthless dong. So pardon us if we should curse the times or seek some comfort in the childish rhymes. Our lives are but the flippings of dimes. Some they look forward, still some look behind. So pardon us if we don't understand how urgent the ghosts, how cold the hand that meets injustice, that will stop the band which tries to play on top of the graves, so we forget what our own spirit craves. It seems a wonder the sky doesn't fall, or change its hue, or swallow us all.
I love it, Zachary. What is your poem about?
My poem is really about the discombobulation of living with so much death but also of being on our own for so long that I think so many of us experienced during the COVID-19 pandemic, or the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, I should say. And the ways in which people in that strange headspace turn either to a sort of desperate cynicism or reliance on small things, and still others look for easy answers and big, sweeping worldviews that often become extremist or deeply troubling.
Right. So you're struck by the disorganized and different responses from people.
Exactly.
Right. So, Art, I can't think of anyone more well qualified to comment on this than you. You've observed this as a citizen, as a teacher, and of course as a scholar. How would you characterize the responses of people to the pandemic?
I mean, it's interesting. I think when you watch the movies, when there's a big threat from the outside, there's always been this belief that would band everyone together. And sort of like in Independence Day, the aliens come down and suddenly we're all one. But actually, I think, and of course Jeremy, you know this from a historical standpoint. That's actually rarely the case, and it certainly wasn't the case here, where in fact the threat from the outside heightened a lot of the divisions that people were experiencing, because in some sense we were afraid. And we were unsure of what to do, and we, there was a wonderful Onion headline at some point that said something like unprecedented use of the word unprecedented, because we just, none of us really knew how to act, and consequently we tended to retreat back into the comfort of the familiar conversations that we were having with people, and I think that it tended to reinforce our pre-existing beliefs, and it cut down on the number of interactions we ended up having with other people, folks whom we might disagree with, that might actually temper some of our each of our more radical tendencies. And so I think in many ways a lot of people ended up spinning further in whatever direction they tend towards anyhow.
So if I hear you right, or you're saying it narrowed our worlds, it made our world smaller?
Well, it certainly made our social world smaller. And it, that was true both in terms of the actual people we interact with, but also if we think about media, because we weren't having to have conversations with lots of people, we even tended to consume just a particular narrow strain of media that was fairly consistent with our existing beliefs. So yeah, I think for most of us, our world did get narrower.
And is it fair to say that this had a widely unhealthy effect on people's psychology, or is that overstating the case?
I think the whole situation had a generally unhealthy effect on most people's psychology. I think, one of the things that we know from decades of psychology research is that the ability to influence the world, or what psychologists usually call agency, has a big impact on your psychological well-being. When you feel like you are the author of your destiny, you feel pretty good about life. And when you feel like you are being carried along by events, you tend to feel relatively bad about it. And of course, the pandemic was something that most of us had no control over whatsoever. And consequently, I think most of us just felt stressed and bad about it to begin with. And so when you combine that with the social isolation, it was just not a good time for most people.
How do you think grief? What role did grief play in this psychological moment in American history? Because we were living through times, and we continue to live through times, when thousands of people are dying of this illness on a regular basis, and yet there never really seemed to be a moment of public grief that anyone in society could feel attached to.
Yeah, Zachary, that's such an interesting way of thinking about it. As I've thought about the pandemic, one of the things that's made grief difficult is that grief generally occurs at the point where there is some distinct passing or loss. And so, the death of a loved one, of course, the 5 stages of grief that we all hear about that Kubler-Ross described, she actually described those first, not about death, but in the reactions of people who were given diagnoses for terminal illnesses. But what's fascinating about each of those is that there's a certain finality that comes to death, or a certain finality that comes with the diagnosis for an illness that is indeed terminal. And with the pandemic, while there were lots of people who did die, for most of us, the pandemic was just this long period of uncertainty. Remember, back in March of 2020, we were thinking, well, surely by May, this will be over. And then by May, we were thinking, well, okay, maybe October or November. And it took an awfully long time for us to realize, no, this is actually going to be going on for an awfully long time. It's very hard to grieve a moving target. And so I think we were left with much more anxiety than the ability to go through a process of grief that's actually healing.
And I guess the uncertainty issue plays out in another way too, right? There's no obvious end, right? There's not a moment when the war ends, when the Nazis surrender. And so many of us, myself included as a historian, assumed there would be a kind of 1920s, a post-war moment of celebration and exuberance. And we never seem to have had that, right, Art?
We tried, right? In May of 21, when people started getting vaccinated and before the Delta wave hit, I think people were like, oh, it's over. And then, there was the specter of, well, there was still a little bit of COVID out there. And then the next wave hit and we thought, well, okay, it's not over. And so I think we had a couple of false hopes. And then, but yeah, you're absolutely right. There was not an armistice day where we could all, have ticker tape parades in the street.
And one of the things we talked about actually at the beginning of the pandemic, when we discussed the 1918 pandemic in the United States, the Spanish flu, as it's often termed, was the way in which generations of people who lived through that moment collectively forgot or refused to talk about their experience, an experience that in terms of death toll was worse than the First World War. Do you think we've, as a society, fallen back on that same strategy of denial?
Well, I think it is definitely something we'd like to forget. It's funny. I mean, there's very little of it captured in television and in movies and in other in stories. Really, we have the time before, the time after, and even most of the media that was produced, the films and the TV shows really skipped over the masks, right? So we have to some degree erased this from our collective memory of what's going on. I think it does seem to be recapitulating that era.
And just to dwell on that a little bit, Art, because it's so interesting, right? I mean, with the analogy to a war again, you can make heroic or dystopian movies of World War I that are entertaining. Yeah. But a movie about people sitting at home suffering or sitting at home waiting and not suffering, there's really no entertainment value in that. It's hard to put together a narrative structure. What effect do we know from psychology that these sorts of forgotten moments have on people? I mean, it's an experience you have, but it's an experience where you not only lack agency, but you lack an articulate narrative, a way of talking about it. What can we expect that to mean to people?
I think one of the things that is potentially concerning about this is that it could create a kind of persistent anxiety for people. So my wonderful colleague, Jamie Pennebaker in psychology at UT, has done some wonderful work on expressive writing when people have gone through a trauma. And one of the things that expressive writing about a difficult incident does is it helps you to create a narrative that essentially weaves the strands of your life story together into something coherent, which is particularly important when you've gone through something difficult. I think that what we're seeing is because people are just kind of stowing away the last few years rather than really analyzing it and telling a good story about it, we have a bit of a disconnect among all of the threads of what happened that could actually create some longer term anxiety because we haven't really told a good story about this era in which there was fear, and we all, I think all of us were touched by the pandemic in one way or another. Most of us know a few people at least who died of COVID, and if you don't really grab control of that and turn it into a narrative part of your life, you run the risk of just having this general anxiety that doesn't seem to have a source, that can have an impact on how you continue to see things moving forward. And that's really not a healthy place to be.
I've seen some of that, I think, Art, in the way you described it so well, really, in some of our students.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they lost crucial years of their high school experience, their social experience, and and they don't know where to begin to talk about it. And I think they feel discouraged from even talking about it.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. It was for high school students and college students, where these are the period of life that many of us look back on so fondly, and for them, they didn't have some of those key experiences, but we're not really encouraging people to talk about that and to talk about the loss that's associated with it, but rather to figure out how to soldier on from that. I think I think actually we should be encouraging people to talk about what that loss was and to talk about what they'd like to make up for on that, because I think it's just an important part of development to have a rich story about your upbringing. It's funny when you think about it. I mean, I know my grandfather went through the Great Depression as a younger as a child and teen, and it had a continued impact on his outlook on finances in life throughout his life. And I feel like in part that was because he did not, and was probably never encouraged to step back and ask, what did that era and not having enough money and not having enough food, what impact did that have on his psyche?
Precisely. I think certainly for my grandparents, there was a similar trauma. And then there was an even more difficult trauma, the trauma of being a refugee, of migration. Mm-hmm. And that was even harder to talk about.
Yeah.
Zachary, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, you experienced this.
I think as a society, to a certain degree, we're very comfortable with talking about like personal trauma or the things that we've personally overcome, but talking about these things on a collective level is really difficult. So I think that there's a sense that, like, okay, all of us suffered this together, particularly among young people, right? There's this sense of collective suffering, but it's not something that you talk about because it's something that implicitly everyone around you assume to understand, even though we all experience the pandemic in different ways. So I think to a certain degree, we've attempted to move on with a sort of acknowledgement of this shared experience that remains tacit and unspoken.
Hmm. Art, are there good models for addressing this lacuna?
Yeah, well, I mean, as I say, I think that some of the work that Jamie Pennebaker does of suggesting that we actually write about it, write about what did it feel like, what was it like, those the darkest moments you had, what were they like? It's unpleasant to do that. It's no fun to write about difficult times, but it does help to create that story. And I think that actually in this case, because of exactly what Zachary was saying, that it's a shared experience, that after writing about it, sharing that writing, talking about it, and sharing some of the language around it. One of the things that makes language so powerful is it gives us words to name things. And once we have those words and can use those, they become things that we can then manipulate psychologically. And I think if we had a more of a shared vocabulary around the pandemic, it actually might help us to move on from it a little bit more easily.
Art, do you think that the difficulty we've had in narrating and naming our feelings of the last few years, has that contributed to what so many of us have seen, which is what appears to be a degrading of civic institutions and civic relations, the way people talk to one another, the way they interact with one another? Do you see these as related phenomena?
Well, I think in order to engage in civic life, you have to be willing to talk about things, and you have to have some amount of common ground. The core to being able to have any discussion and for that discussion to be meaningful is for there to be some sort of common ground, meaning that there's both a common set of concepts that you want to refer to and a common language for talking about it. And if you lack that, then it's very hard to communicate. There's some classic studies done in the 1960s about giving directions in New York City. And what they found was if a New Yorker was giving directions to another New Yorker, they needed way fewer words to tell them how to get from one place to another than if a New Yorker was speaking to someone who wasn't from New York. Because a New Yorker could just say, look, go head downtown 4 blocks and then, make a left, and it's a half a block up the street. Whereas, you have to orient somebody towards like which direction is uptown versus downtown and things like that if you're speaking to somebody who's not a New Yorker. And I think that what's happened with us right now is because we don't have a lot of common language. And I think this extends to common language related to the political response to the pandemic as well. We don't have common language for that, which makes it difficult for us to then begin to talk to each other about the pandemic, but about lots of other things as well, because I do think the pandemic brought to the surface very different beliefs about what the government should be doing, about the relationship between individuals and civic institutions. And those differences were never named in a way that gives us a common way of discussing that. And that's just made it very difficult for us to communicate with each other about some of the very difficult things that have happened politically over the last few years.
That's so well said, Art. And I feel this myself. I want, like you, to be able to talk to everyone, but I have found it so hard to talk to people who are vaccine deniers. Mm-hmm. Or COVID deniers. And it seems as if those attitudes have only hardened. How do we understand that, and what do we do about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that we have to do is to recognize that we are in a real way speaking a different language from people who hold this vastly different set of beliefs and have not really had an opportunity to have conversations about those with anyone other than the folks that they believe in and that believe the same way that they do. And so what happens is a lot of people will write a lot of words about this, and they'll post them on the internet or post them as comments on social media. I occasionally get emails from people based on things that I've written, who hold different beliefs, but there's no conversation happening. And I think that's actually that critical piece is ultimately that in order to communicate with people who hold very different beliefs about the pandemic, for example, than we do, is to actually have conversations in which there's a real back and forth. Because what conversation does is it forces each of us to think similarly for some period of time, even if we believe we disagree. We have to agree on the terms of the discussion in order to be able to communicate effectively. And that's so the paradox is that when you have a conversation with someone that you disagree with, you leave that conversation thinking more similarly to them than when you started, even if you believe you disagree more at the end of the conversation.
But how do we do that with people, or not just with? I don't think it's an individual people group or person necessarily, but how do we as a society reckon with the fact that coming out of this pandemic, those conversations are no longer, or they don't seem possible anymore, not just because we disagree with each other so much, but because we can't seem to agree on a basic set of facts, right? On the basic premise from which all sort of conversations about health policy or education or et cetera have to begin.
Yeah, I mean, it has become even more difficult. I agree with you, because it's so hard to figure out where even the basis for the conversation ought to be. I think that what you said is exactly right. And I think that to the extent that we want to communicate, though, we have to start by trying to find some common ground somewhere, right? And figure out if there's anything that we can agree on. And sometimes the way to start that conversation is to focus on things that we might both value rather than trying to establish a set of facts or a set of causal beliefs. I think that at times we might at least be able to find some commonality in some of the values that we have that we can use to then begin as a wedge to start having some kind of conversation.
That makes a lot of sense. And what are the things we as a society you think can do to encourage the conversations to go in that direction? I mean, we're recording this right now as we're watching even one party that claims to be about the same things in Congress, the Republican Party, unable even to talk about how to choose a leader of their own party, right? So how would you recommend in that kind of setting or any setting that we as a society begin to move conversations in this very productive sounding direction, Art?
I actually think that one way to do it is to make the conversations a little bit more local. And of course, you know very well that the power of local politics, right? And that, as much time as we spend thinking about the president of the United States and Congress, and even the governor of a state and the state legislature, that so much of what affects our daily lives is what happens at the local level. Are my streets paved? Is there water coming to my house? Do I have power? And some of that is, much of that is influenced by local issues. And I feel like maybe the way out of this is to stop looking to Washington, D.C. In the United States, and stop even in Texas looking to the State House in Austin, and just start thinking about what's happening in my neighborhood, what's happening more locally, because I think a lot of the disagreements begin to fade when we're talking about things that are happening in the neighborhood. And we can use that to build up some set of common ground that we can then begin to use over time to hopefully address some of the thornier issues that happen as you pop up to the national level. But I think you're much more likely to find that agreement at the local level, or at least agreement on the terms of discussion, even if you don't agree on how to resolve the problem.
Right. No, and I think it brings us back to a literature that you, I'm sure, know better than I do, right, from the 50s and 60s, very much on the sociology of neighborhoods and the ways in which neighborhood communities are built. The challenge, of course, is neighborhoods tend to be a little more homogeneous, right? And that's one of the reasons that makes these conversations a little easier sometimes, but it has costs as well, does it not?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think, you certainly, there's always a danger when you end up in a pure echo chamber. But I do think that if you don't necessarily need to stick in your own neighborhood in order to be able to talk locally. Right. I mean, if in Austin, it's overall it has some diversity to it, even if a particular street doesn't. And so,
Right.
Finding people who really you disagree with on some fundamental issues, but still share the common ground of our geography, would actually create those opportunities to have discussions that are potentially fraught, because you're speaking to somebody who may have significant disagreements with you, but at least you are focused on things that are more local and therefore maybe a little bit less tinged with the national political discourse.
Do you think we've done that as a university, Art?
I not over the last few years that successfully, in part because of the pandemic, right? I mean, I think we pivoted as a university early on to do a lot of things on Zoom. We taught on Zoom. We had gatherings on Zoom, but which is a great platform for convening people so that we can do something during a pandemic, but it's a terrible platform for having side conversations,
right?
Because really only one person can talk at a time. And so I think the real question is going to be what happens as we exit the pandemic, or at least exit that acute phase in which we're not getting together. Do we create opportunities for people to convene, but opportunities for people to convene in spaces in which we then promote some degree of conversation. So I have had the privilege over the years of attending the Great Conversations program that the Annette Strauss Institute at the University of Texas runs. And one of the things I love about that is there's a panel, and so everyone sits and watches some speakers, but then there's the encouragement to have a local conversation at a table that isn't necessarily made up with a bunch of people that are all folks you're likely to agree with. And I find that to be really, that kind of experience, and that's a very powerful thing that a university can do.
I agree 100%. Zachary.
Yeah, how do we get young people, college students, and younger high school students, et cetera, who maybe have no experience of this kind of productive civics, who have either only seen the divisive politics or the divisive civic discourse, and have never actually experienced what the power of these local conversations and of true civic engagement? How do we get them to understand the importance of that, and also just basically how to do that?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and I would love to see high schools create opportunities for classes to get together, just an individual class, say a history class, or to get together with 3 or 4 community members and just have a discussion. Right. I mean, practice having discussions with people, and practice saying things where you realize that the opinion you hold might not actually be the majority opinion. And just getting some practice articulating some of the things that you believe in a setting in which it's a true conversation. So it's not a debate. There's not going to be a winner of the conversation in which your goal is just to be understood by the people around you. I think that's the only way we can do it, is to practice it. And I agree with you that there's a lot of people who've had no practice with that whatsoever. And I do think that the pandemic has limited the opportunities for high school students and college students to be able to practice that skill.
It seems to me, Art, it's a set of skills that, for a variety of reasons, a wide swath of our population either lacks or has forgotten. Do you agree with that? And what would you do to try to rectify that?
I do think that's the case. I think we have not really encouraged people to sit around and have just conversations about things in which, and particularly to have conversations in which the goal is just to learn about the person that you're talking to, as opposed to believing that you have to win the conversation. I think we have turned conversations into debates, in which at the end of the day somebody's got to emerge as the winner. Someone has to have convinced the other person of something. And I think we need to get back to the days of just having a conversation with people, right? And
Right.
Maybe the best way to practice that is not to start with controversial topics, but just to encourage people to get out a little bit more with the people on their street and just talk. I mean, get outside and have a conversation with your neighbors. It's funny. I mean, how rarely most people have the opportunity just to stand out on the yard and converse with their neighbors.
Absolutely. I mean, it seems to me it's of a piece with an overscheduled life,
Yeah.
where we don't leave ourselves time for the purposeless discussion, which of course has a deeper purpose, but is not directed, as you say, at lobbying someone or trying to get a particular outcome. But we don't have time for that in our lives, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. The other thing is, when you have those conversations with people who you disagree with on other matters, you come to realize their fundamental humanity. And it seems like a weird thing to say, but I think it's easy to demonize the other, right? To take somebody and label them as being, in a different, they believe they're a member of a different political party than I am, so they are the other, and there's just something wrong with them. And ultimately, when you sit down and have a conversation with people, you realize, no, actually, 99% of what we're trying to do in our lives is pretty much the same. And then there's a little bit of stuff that around the edges that differs. And when you recognize that, it does create, I think, a lot more common ground and a lot more respect that then enables us to begin ultimately to tackle some of the more difficult issues where we do have significant disagreements across people.
Right. And we know this is true because when we study hateful ideologies and hateful groups, what they always try to do is dehumanize the enemy.
Yeah.
They try to depersonalize, make the enemy seem inhuman, so that justifies whatever the kind of hate or violence is. So clearly the opposite matters
That's right.
in one way or another. So Art, as you know, we always like to close on a note of a sort of practical usefulness, bringing this vast knowledge that you've shared with us basically to a practical level for many of our listeners, and you do this better than anyone I know. What are the things our listeners can do who are motivated after listening to what you've said to actually make a difference? Clearly, they should go out and talk to their neighbors more, but what are some other steps that you would suggest to listeners who want to make a difference in this direction?
I would say, first of all, don't underestimate the value of a cup of coffee. Right. I mean, invite somebody that and you sort of disagree with them. Invite them out for coffee with no other intention other than to get to know them a little bit better. Just do that once. I think that matters. Another thing is to create a signal of our common some of our commonality. One of the things that I was suggesting after the 2020 election was that everyone should stick an American flag out on their yard, just to demonstrate that regardless of the party affiliations we may have, that fundamentally we still all all have some pride in being part of the United States. So it's not just having those conversations. It's going out of your way to signal that we have some degree of commonality. And then I would say the third thing is, to the extent that we want to be involved politically with people at the moment, maybe focusing more on local issues than national ones for the moment is a great way to go. Not that there aren't significant national issues that need to be addressed, but actually we may find the best way to join hands with people who we don't agree with on lots of other issues is to focus on a certain number of things that are happening in our backyards, that if we can realize we can work together to solve some problems locally, we might create a little bit more of the trust that we need to be able to work on some of the thornier national issues.
Zachary, what do you think? Art has given us a compelling case for coffee, for flags, and for going local.
Yes, I agree. I think
you agree on flags?
I you know my thoughts on flags already, but I think that the power of very not just local in terms of local issue-based conversation, but local in terms of the people the people you already interact with but have maybe never thought to really have a deep conversation with. I think that's really powerful. But I also think that what this real post-pandemic civics lesson teaches us is that we need to have more civics lessons and more regularly. I think one of the biggest failings, I think, of our school system during the pandemic was not to prioritize civics education. I think that one of the most valuable things that a student can take from the classroom is how to have a civil conversation. And I hope that these conversations don't just occur on podcasts or among academics, but also at schools and between young people.
Well, and I think what this conversation has displayed, and Art has given us so much good material here, is that a conversation about civics is about much more than simply reading the Constitution,
Exactly.
Though that's very important too. And it's certainly a conversation about civics is not politically conservative or politically progressive. It actually is not about politics at all. It's about the very ways in which we interact as citizens. Democracy, as our guiding spirit, Franklin Roosevelt would say, is about much more than the laws and the parchment paper. It's about the behaviors and interactions of people, and I think that's what Art has shared with us. Final question to you, Art, to close us out. Are you optimistic?
I am optimistic, but I fear that that's also just a trait of mine, that I tend to be a glass half full kind of person. But look, I would say that things are never as bad as they seem when times are bad, just as they're never quite as good as they seem when times are good. And I feel like, people are resilient. And if we're willing to get out there and to have those kinds of conversations, we can begin to heal from the pandemic and hopefully heal from some of the other political things that have happened around the same time.
You've given probably the best definition of democracy also, right? It's never as chaotic as you think it is, nor is it ever as orderly as you hope it would be. Right. That's the world we're in, and that's the opportunity we face. Art, thank you so much for sharing your insights and your wisdom with us today.
It was my pleasure. Thanks so much for the invitation to talk with you.
And Zachary, thank you for your poem and your wonderful questions and insights. And thank you most of all to our loyal listeners for joining us for another year of This Is Democracy.
This podcast is produced by the Liberal Arts ITS Development Studio
and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin.
The music in this episode was written and recorded by Harris Codini.
Stay tuned for a new episode every week. You can find This Is Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher.
See you next time.